As we look at the duties of members this morning, kind of over an overall heading of the way that the members are supportive of the ministry in particular. So we've seen prayer, we've seen submission to the rule of the elders, and we also saw an overall following of the way in which they're ordering the church. But this morning, I want to look at a variety of things. And so the first one is the duty of a member to stand by their ministers in times of tribulation. So that would be if I get arrested for reading Romans 1 or something, that you're all going to defend my good name as you have opportunity. You're not going to be like, yeah, he fill in the blank because he read Romans 1, and we support him in that way. I think this one hopefully is a little obvious, but it does fall under this overall heading. And of course, as this is considering the support, it does assume that the reason why the person is in trouble is for the good of the gospel, right? So it wouldn't be if I get arrested for fill in the blank, that would be a sin. There'd be still calling me to repentance as a brother, support in that way, but we're talking about support for falling under sort of difficulties. And we can see that in a variety of places in the New Testament in terms of Paul's frequent allusions to, remember my chains, or to send support, such as one of the brothers, or to bring my writing utensils, or what have you. That they weren't ashamed of him in these ways. So we could kind of group all those verses under this heading and just have an overall sort of support clause underneath this. Again, it's not hopefully anything too different than what we would already have done, but just kind of stating the obvious that it does fall for the members in that way. And I think there are areas where this could be very gray, that it could be difficult, and I think that's where the rubber really meets the road here as it relates to the congregation walking together. Won't throw out any hypotheticals because it'd be difficult to imagine and to generate the sense of what does that look like, but I think working through that is important and thinking about that as we would go forward. Secondly, we already highlighted in our Q&A session briefly a couple weeks ago about that we're tithing in terms of maintaining the ministry of the word. And our Reformed Baptist fathers oftentimes looked at a variety of different sorts of texts. It could be either the text dealing with Paul, where he's saying that he has a right to live by the gospel, not muzzling the ox, so on and so forth. And that would again be duty of the members as we have opportunity, right? And as we can. And secondly, a lot of times, just want to cover this verse. If you don't see this verse as teaching this doctrine, that's fine. I just want to make you aware that this is where our confession and catechisms often go to support this doctrine. If you'd like to look at Galatians chapter 6. And I said that at the beginning because exegetically, it has a very rich tradition in terms of supporting this doctrine in the early modern period. As far as I can tell, about 100 years ago or so, people started reading it a little differently. I'll try to read it or give you the reading in the way that the authors of our confession read it. And again, just want to make you aware of those things. So if you're going through our documents, by our documents I mean our confession or our catechisms, and you see Galatians 6 and you turn there and you say, what is this in terms of this particular doctrine? We'll try to walk it through. But I think in terms of this overall portion, we have in Galatians 6, 1-6, an overall kind of discussing of burdens. But again, I think overall, ultimately, what we see before is a overall call to walking in the Spirit. If you see in verses 16 to 26 of the 5th chapter, and then in that particular set, discussing overall life together. And then if you see in verse 1 of chapter 6, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness, Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is himself when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone, not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load. Now, I think in these first 5 verses, there are a lot of things that we could say in terms of overall walking with one another, or Matthew 18 sort of applications, or just general life together. But the folks that made our confession of faith are going to move into verse 6 and say that it's in the same context. In my version of the ESV, it has a new paragraph. That's not the way they read it. And just as an aside, not to get too deep in the weeds, but when the authors of our confession first signed it publicly, they sent out 3 things to all the churches. They sent out the confession, they sent out the minutes of their meeting, and they sent out another document called the Minister's Maintenance Vindicated, and basically saying you need to pay the pastor. And in a sense that because there was a dispute. Now, they don't say how much you should pay the pastor. They're just simply saying that's part of the duties of the members. So I just highlight all that to say that they're going to read verse 6 of Galatians 6. And to be honest, I don't know. I don't really see this here necessarily in a very clear way. But I do think by way of application, it can work. But again, let's look at verse 6. So they're going to see flowing then of bearing one another's burdens in the first 5 verses. Flowing in verse 6. Let the one who has taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So that as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially those who are of the household of faith. So if you notice in this particular series of verses, we're in Galatians chapter 6, and in the 6th verse, the overall application then that Paul is making in context would be that as we bear one another's burdens, that includes bearing burdens with the one who's teaching, or in other words, sharing in terms of the overall burden of the ministry in that particular way. And then also the sort of verses that would flow out if we accept that reading would be what we're sowing is what we're going to reap in a very practical way. You could imagine very practically if you drive to rural America, wherever, you can go through downtown. There's sections usually, and there's no one there in the churches. There'll be members, but not sort of ministers, and there's a sense in which the Spirit has left that place in a very practical way. Now, again, I don't necessarily see this as super clear myself, so I'm not trying to impose that on anyone this morning, but just simply saying, as you read our documents, you're going to see these verses footnoted, and that's why they're doing that. But it does add further color, perhaps, to the verses that we see in the pastoral epistles and elsewhere. I do want to pause here because I know there were questions related to this last time. Are there any questions in terms of what I've said so far? Yeah, Aaron?
I just have a comment. Comment is, in my research of the, tithing principle and providing support, I definitely support what it's saying here and saying reap what you sow. And what I mean by that is not the current evangelical, maybe evangelical isn't correct, twisted way that televangelists do it, where you're giving to them and then you'll reap, financial reward some other way. No, it's the basic principle of, if I want the church to have money, I have to give the church money. It's super simple like that.
Yeah, and I think the prosperity gospel does, at least it makes me shy away from verses like this at times, in the sense of you don't want to be like sow seed, for $50 every month, you too can be blessed. That instead, simply saying that there is if we want certain practical things to outwork, you have to do it just like we know in any relationship. You want to have a good relationship with your kids, you have to put in the time, your spouse, your church members, that there's a sense in which it would be great if we could all just naturally fall in line every week and love each other perfectly and just ever increasingly amount, but if we never spend time with each other, that would be really difficult to do, to kind of actually build a relationship that goes beyond these well, 5 walls, 6 walls, in that particular way. Yeah. Okay, so if you see Galatians 6, that's what they're thinking about. They're just reading this as one whole sort of thing. If you'd like to read one defense of it, you could look at John Cotton in The Keys of the Kingdom. He has an extended example of this. He does get into the Greek a little bit, and maybe at some time, if you have questions for that, we could walk through that if you'd like. But he's going to make a case that the paragraphs belong together, and that they're not separate. Because otherwise, if you take them separately, 100% agree with how most evangelical scholars would see then verses 1 through 5 as being separate from verses 6 to 10. And oftentimes would consider verses 6 to 10 not necessarily pertaining to monetary maintenance or anything like that. But that's where I would recommend you look, because Cotton's the one that they're citing. So if you read his account, you probably exhaust having to read anything else. Or if you prefer, the other option would be Minister's Maintenance Vindicated, which is written by all the guys that signed our confession. Or it was written by someone, a lot of people think it was Benjamin Keach, and it was sent out by the assembly. And so that, again, is not the scriptures. That, again, is not our confession. That's just how they're reading it together. And I think it's important, as an aside, that as we come to the document, that we understand how they're reading it, so that we can decide whether that's an accurate reading, because we don't just want to adopt 17th century principles. Like, for instance, we can talk in modern English. We don't need to start saying these and thous and thines. And likewise, we don't have to accept the way that they're necessarily reading everything. So hopefully, I don't want to be a dead horse, but I'm just simply saying I don't necessarily agree with that reading myself, but it's there, and that's why we see it laid out, although I think the application is fine. The verses themselves might be different. These verses?
Is there somebody out there saying you should take that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No real big names, but there's like a whole movement, even in the 1689, like don't pay pastors, like they should all be bivocational. I was told, I was considered a lost cause because I was already at seminary. I was told I should get a trade and go do that, and then wait for the church to call me wherever I'd be at the time, because ultimately that's probably how I'm going to have to make my living, and it's kind of extolled in that way. So I think I hadn't really encountered it until I came into our circles, but they're not really
So, in terms of the overall circles, then, there's this. I don't want to cause any problems with our 69 brothers. Typically, from my experience, there's sort of a difference with the Al Martin camp. And so, there, if you don't know, that is the time Trinity Ministerial Academy. They tend to kind of view it that way in terms of like get a trade or get a job, and they're not necessarily looking to maintain the pastor in terms of like paying him. And then there are others who are in the millennial generation who are kind of looking at from a more practical standpoint, saying demographically Christianity is not doing well in the United States, especially when it's Reformed, and so young men going into the ministry should get a career and then enter the ministry and maintain the career, because this is going to be very difficult for any church to have a building, have missionaries, do life with things as they are. So there's kind of two arguments that are kind of coming out this way. So that's why I want to spend time on this. I don't think anyone here has a problem with that. System, you might see it out in the wild.
I don't think it's solved that question. This is the saying that you can't be a pastor and have a second vocation. It's also saying that if the church isn't large enough to support it, you don't have enough work. You got 4 congregations, right? Congregations.
Yeah.
They can make a living off of those people, right? And you have to do something else, and you're probably not going to have 40 hours
It's, yeah, and
I
I,
know this solves that problem. This isn't saying that you should do nothing else but.
no, and that's, I see it like what you're saying in terms of practically you have to figure out what you're going to do. It's just, the principle is if the church has the ability, they should. And if they don't, I would see it as they are falling practically into kind of what verses 6 to 10 lay out. If they don't make it the offer. I do think that these are all sort of practical circumstances that probably are going to become more aware. I know when I was in seminary, as we were graduating, my advisor at the time told us that if you look at what's going on in the Reform world, this is even the Presbyterians, and they tend to be doing better than Reformed Baptists in terms of numbers, that we should be prepared to be bivocational because things are changing, and the way they were in the 60s is not the way they are right now. So like the career arc's going to be different. And I think that's where churches have to kind of figure out when those circumstances are there, how do they slice that, and being comfortable with a variety of arrangements. I'm just saying the principle is there that if the man is going to make his living elsewhere, like Paul did, that's fine. But also the principle is there that the church should be willing to support him as they have opportunity and as they have the ability. Yeah, Ben?
I'm just curious, do you know the numbers in regards to the amount of Reformed Baptist churches in the country? Maybe this estimate, I know there's not too many compared to other churches.
Yeah, if my memory is right, I asked Jim Renahan last year how many he thought there were. He estimated between 300 or 400. So it's fairly small. I mean, if you think about the Wells, for instance, they're a smaller Lutheran group. They have 1,500 congregations, give or take. So, I mean, they're way bigger, and you never, they play nice in the sandbox, so, like, you never hear about them, whereas 689 guy is like a trend on social media, and not in a good way. So, it's a very small group. And that would include folks that would take the confession very strictly, and that would include folks that take it more broadly. So that's a high estimate. I mean, if you want to take it for folks who take it strictly, I mean, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find 100 churches.
Whereas maybe like the SBC may have 20,000 churches.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really small, and yes. Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, let's keep moving along then if there's no further questions, comments. No? Okay. If you do have comments, I'd love to talk further offline if you would like. And then finally, I would like to highlight the sort of way in which this is all coming together finally is going to be in the way that we see the church coming together at the agreement of the elders. If you'd like to look at Acts chapter 14 with me. Acts chapter 14. This last point is just a really practical sort of point. So if you think about what we've seen so far, we're praying for the ministry. We're submitting to the spiritual rule of the elders. We are supporting them in times of trouble. We're supporting them financially as we have opportunity and as is appropriate. And then finally, we're seeing that we are going to follow them as it submits to the sort of practical or prudential running of the church, the kind of nitty-gritty details about, like, for instance, if I'm calling a congregational meeting for February 8th, that you're going to attend, if you're a member as you're able to, right? That I have the opportunity to call those meetings per our Constitution, and you're going to follow in that particular way. You can imagine it wouldn't work so well. I call a meeting and not a single member outside of myself shows up. That we're saying that we're going to follow as we have opportunity in those practical sorts of ways. Or saying I'm calling a vote on this particular issue. You yourself may not see a need for the vote, but you're going to sort of follow through and go under those things. That's that final point. And one example we see with this in Acts chapter 14, verse 27, when they arrived and gathered the church together, speaking ultimately of the brothers or of the elders in this case. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. They remained no little time with the disciples. There's many other occurrences in Acts where we see a sort of calling together of the church, and it's just a practical outworking and really does follow under the rule in general. But we just want to highlight this last particular point, that as we're looking in the days ahead at the way in which the members and the officers specifically relate to one another, we'll see that our Constitution, our Confession of Faith, and the Scriptures generally appropriate to the elders the right to order the affairs of the church beforehand. In other words, we don't come to the meeting and I say, okay, like, what do we want to have on the agenda today? I can go forward and say, hey, there's this opportunity, here's all the details, we can vote on it today, sort of thing. I can say, hey, at our annual meeting, we're going to have a budget, and here's a proposed budget. I can't, in our Constitution, that's affirmed by the membership. So ultimately then, I don't have the right to say this is the budget and there's no vote, but there is a vote. Or people apply for membership. Our Constitution has it that I would say, hey, these folks are applying for membership. Here's their testimony. If you have any concerns or reasons why they shouldn't become members that are valid, please bring them to me and we'll hammer those out. And if you don't, then it's considered a sort of silent assent, and I'll bring them into the membership of the church. And so on and so forth. Another example would be, which kind of conflates with spiritual rule, would be the elders have the right then as well as to bar folks from coming to the table, and under suspension. And under our Constitution, the way that we've arranged it to practically work is I just simply announce, hey, so-and-so is under suspension. And all that then falls under wisdom principles. Each church could do things differently. Each set of elders, even within the Constitution, can do things differently. But it's just simply saying that the members are going to follow that. Or in other words, give the elders the benefit of the doubt. Deal charitably with them and consent with that in that way. Now, if it falls into sin, where it's no longer prudence, that's another matter. Or if we have it in our Constitution, that's just how we're going to run things, and vice versa. Then, if it's in the Constitution and I don't do it, or the elders don't do it, then you're free to say we're not doing that because we've already agreed. But there are a lot of times in which it is not clear. So that's that final sort of point, and I want to sort of wrap up in general, and we'll move next week into another section. This overall sort of consideration of members. I want to look at reception of members next week. But that's where we're going in terms of these general membership sort of realities. I think that's just really what we have to do to live life together. And we'll see then how this overall life plays out in terms of the members having certain rights and duties, and then also submitting to the rule of the elders. Because sort of in conclusion, if you think about various sorts of states, by that I mean political arrangements, you can think about sort of a dictatorship where there's one person or one group at the top and they tell everyone how it's going to go. In general, we might call that a dictatorship. We could call it a monarchy. And in that sort of arrangement, that would kind of correlate loosely with our Episcopal friends, where you have a bishop at the top, sort of what we see with the Catholics, with the Pope. The Pope calls the shots, and everybody else sort of reacts. No, that's an oversimplification, but just in general. Secondly, you could consider a sort of democracy where it's really just down to everything has to be decided by the common vote of the people. That would be what's historically referred to as Brownism in relation to a minister that came up with that consideration. That would be more like your stereotypical Southern Baptist church or like Landmark Baptist Church. We are not that. Instead, we would fall in line with our Presbyterian friends and have more of a republic sort of setting. And by that, I mean that there are certain things that the congregation votes on, but ultimately when they call officers, those officers are given real authority to sort of execute the affairs of the state. But in all these things, Christ is overall the king of the church. And so he's ruling and reigning through these things. And I bring up this sort of picture of the political state to kind of consider then the interplay between those things. And helpfully, or maybe not helpfully, it's kind of what's going, the discussion, if you look everywhere in our culture right now, is on this whole point, at least the way I read things, which may not be good. But in the sense of how do the officers deal with we the people and vice versa. And that's kind of what we're looking at here in terms of the church. And so thinking about those things in light of the scriptures, not in light of our current news cycle. But let's be dismissed, and we'll come back together in about 15 minutes.